we're now going to welcome Dr Louise Hickman, who's Senior Lecturer in Philosophy and Ethics at Newman University, which is in Birmingham, if you didn't know that. She originally, in fact, was here in Cambridge. She did her PhD here. In fact, she was a member of my own college, and the one where the Faraday Institute is currently located, St Edmund's College, just next door here. So her main research interest is in the philosophy of religion and also science religion. She's published a number of books. I hope at least one or two of them are on our bookstall. One of them is entitled 18th Century Dissent and the Cambridge Platonism, Reconceiving the Philosophy of Religion, which came out just last year. And she's written and edited a number of other volumes and books, which maybe I won't take time to mention here, because I don't want to take her time from you. So please do welcome Dr. Louise Hickman, who's going to speak to us on the historical perspectives on natural theology. Thank you.
Well, this afternoon then, I'm going to give you an overview of natural theology, which is basically going to be about 1,500 years in the space of 45 minutes. So it'll be a bit of a whistle-stop tour. However, I will stop at various points along the way just to explain a little bit about how natural theology has developed. First of all, though, I should start with a definition of natural theology. And I'll start with James Barr's because there's no strict consensus really about how natural theology should be defined. However, most people adopt something along these lines, that natural theology means something like that by nature, by virtue of being human beings, men and women have a certain degree of knowledge of God and awareness of God, or at least a capacity for such awareness. And that knowledge or awareness exists anterior to the special revelation of God. So it is something based on reason or the senses, or both of those, which is distinct from the divine. So we can have some knowledge of God through reason or the senses. And one of the major points throughout history and the interpretation of the history of natural theology is whether we can make that distinction and how we should make it and what those historical figures were doing when they embrace natural theology. So in summary, if knowledge from science or from reason can give rise to some insights about the divine or about ethics or metaphysical questions, then that's classed as being natural theology. Now, one of the earliest surviving arguments for the existence of God, which could therefore be classed as natural theology, we find in Plato. And Plato was one of the first to argue for the existence of God or the gods and for the gods' providential care of human beings, because when he was arguing the gods and goddesses of ancient Greece used humans for their sport and were not particularly caring of human beings. But Plato argued against this. In the Laws, Book 10, he puts forward an argument that design and the concept of soul is opposed to the concept of matter and chance. So not everything, Plato argues, is the result of matter and chance. There are some things like order, life, the kind of regularity in the universe that hasn't come from chance. And he argues that one of those things that hasn't come from chance is ethical value. So we have a very strong argument that ethics, that goodness and truth is something that hasn't just emerged out of a chance universe. So these things instead are not the result of chance, they are instead the result of soul. So soul, he says, is the cause of all things, and it's the cause of good and evil, beauty and ugliness, justice and injustice. So we've got a very strong argument then against a materialistic view of the universe. And in the Timaeus, in his dialogue with Timaeus, Plato describes a myth of the demiurge or a demigod who models the whole of creation on the archetypal ideas. So the demiurge has sight of the archetypal ideas, and the universe is then modelled upon those values and those ideas. So for Plato, this means the whole universe somehow reflects orderliness. And the whole universe is therefore suffused with moral value. So it's not a chaotic universe. It's a universe that can be understood by human reason. So this means that human beings can, according to Plato, find out something of what it is for humans to flourish. The most important question Plato thought we could ask is, how should I live? It's an ethical question. And for him, we are capable of finding out at least part of the answer to that question. And this idea that the universe is orderly and that it somehow is reflected, or it somehow reflects these transcendent values, is an idea that we find picked up by the patristic scholars, for example. So the patristics were, many of them, like Augustine, were readers of Plato and Aristotle and the Neo-Platonists. And so Augustine says, but some people read books in order to find out about God, yet there is a great book. Look above you, look below you. God set before your eyes the things that he has made. So we see this idea of, I suppose, the book of scriptures and then also the book of nature. For Augustine, there's no necessary conflict between the two, and the world itself is a divine artifact. If God has created the world, then it must be able to show us something about God. It must reflect something about the Creator and the Creator's own intentions. So Augustine valued maths, anatomy, history, and philosophy as a source of truth, because God has created the universe. And he instructed Christians to keep up to date with scientific developments. But he's cautious, because he does suggest that humans can't gain divine knowledge apart from Scripture. So Scripture is still ultimately important for Augustine in his approach to what we can gain from reason and from the sciences. Aquinas, we've got to the Middle Ages already, for Aquinas, his theology was one that saw reason and revelation as both coming from God and not conflicting. But he thought that some truths can be reached through natural reason. So human beings have a capacity, reason, to understand something about God apart from God's revelation through Scripture. So it's knowledge gained independently, to some extent, independently from revelation. And I think Aquinas' most famous natural theology is perhaps to be found in his 5 ways to prove the existence of God. In his Summa Theologiae, an enormous book, goes into 20-odd volumes when it's translated and published. In part of this work, he asks whether God exists. How do we know that God exists? And he replies that there are 5 ways to prove God's existence. And I'll just explain to you the first way, which is often called a cosmological argument. Aquinas suggests that we can see through our senses that some things are in motion. Whatever is in motion, he says, must be put in motion by something else. So for him, motion cannot just start out of nothing. So everything that moves must be put in motion by something else. But that chain cannot go on forever, because otherwise it doesn't really explain why there are things in motion here and now. We can't just go on for like an infinite regress, if you like. So he insists that we can't explain the motion that we see if we just assume that something has been put in motion by something else forever and ever and ever. It doesn't make sense of it. So therefore, he says that in order to make sense of why we experience motion, why we see motion, it's necessary to arrive, he says, at a first mover, which we call God. So the motion that we see, for him, leads us to the idea of a first mover. And there's much debate here about how to interpret Aquinas. And so reading him has become very important today because many scholars are split. There are some who see Aquinas as trying to propose an argument to convince everybody, including pagans or, if you like, atheists, though I use that term with caution. There are others who see Aquinas as addressing a faith community. So which he was doing, we're not entirely sure. It's not absolutely obvious which it is. So therefore, we can't conclude with 100% certainty whether this is an argument that's meant to persuade an atheist. But it's certainly an argument that works on the basis of dependence. And for this type of cosmological argument that Aquinas is putting forward, he's not necessarily saying that we're going back in time. We're not looking for a first mover back in time at the beginning of time. For Aquinas, it's more a question about why is there something rather than nothing? What explains the fact that there are things in motion? And one example Aquinas gives us is to think in terms of a stick moving a stone. We might look at the stone that's being moved if we imagine somebody moving a stone with a big stick, and we ask, why is that stone moving? Well, it's moving because it's being moved by the stick. And then why is the stick moving? Because it's being moved by a person. But that's a continuous movement. You're not going back in time to explain that motion. The stone is continuously being moved by the stick, by the person. So for Aquinas, supposing that God exists, saying we have to have this concept of God, is, I think, a question about trying to explain why things exist here and now. So it perhaps gives us an idea of a God who keeps the universe in being every moment, all the time, continuously. So there are cosmological arguments that attempt to go back in time. I'll say a bit more about one of those in a minute. But Aquinas' 5 ways, I think, they're a cosmological argument because they say that everything in existence must depend on something, and that something must be something that doesn't depend on anything else for its existence. Its existence is kind of guaranteed, if you like, by virtue of what kind of being it is. And God is the being that guarantees God's own existence. So those, or Aquinas' argument, I think, is perhaps one of the most well-known examples of a kind of natural theology in the medieval times. When we get to the 17th and 18th centuries, we see a definite flourishing of natural theology. This period in time has been called a heyday of natural theology. In the 17th and 18th centuries, we see a blossoming of lots of different arguments for God's existence. It was very, very popular at that time. That there were so many arguments that suddenly started popping up everywhere is usually put down to the rise of reason, the rise of science at that time. That followed the scientific revolution. There was an increased confidence in human reason and in the sciences, and that increased confidence allowed many theologians to think perhaps we can understand something of God through the use of science and reason and so on. There was also the 17th and particularly the 18th centuries, a rise in what was called atheism. It's hard to define atheism at that time. Sometimes atheists were just anybody who was politically controversial or didn't really quite fit with the status quo. Atheism was a term of abuse that got flung around an awful lot. But certainly many of those theologians who put forward arguments for God's existence saw themselves as somehow defending belief in the existence of God in the face of sort of growing atheism and skepticism about God's existence. So Samuel Clarke is one example of a natural theologian at this time. So he's an English philosopher, a natural theologian, and he gave the Boyle Lecture in 1704. The Boyle Lectures are named after Robert Boyle, who endowed a series of lectures to prove the truth of the Christian religion and to answer new difficulties that were being raised against the Christian religion. So it's a series of lectures, and Clarke gave a famous lecture which he then published. And in this argument, Clarke says that you can argue partly from reason and partly from science in order to discover something about the divine and the divine's existence. He suggests that something must have existed from all eternity. For Clarke, matter was not a self-sufficient thing. So the mechanistic world was not a self-sufficient system. Matter, he thought, did not have the power of self-motion. It couldn't suddenly start doing things on its own. So to explain motion, Clarke thought we need something immaterial. That could be a soul or it could be God. It's the same thing, I think, when it comes to human beings. What makes us want to, or able to, get out of a chair and move across a room? For Clarke, that couldn't just be the physical stuff of our bodies. It had to be the soul inside of us, or minds, making our physical stuff do that. So for Clarke, it's a bit like that when we look at the universe as a whole. And this was also something that Isaac Newton thought too, that matter is not a self-sufficient system, and we need the divine or God to sort of interact in that system to keep it moving. So for Clarke, something now exists. We can see that. So something always was. Otherwise, nothing would exist now. So he thinks that things don't suddenly come into existence. It's impossible for something to be produced by nothing for him. So things don't come into existence without a cause. So whatever exists must have a cause or a reason for its existence. It's got to have a foundation for its existence, a reason why it exists rather than doesn't exist. And this cause, he says, well, we've got two alternatives. One is an infinite succession of dependent beings that is just produced endlessly with no cause. And the other is some self-existing cause which exists necessarily. And he thinks the only obvious solution is that it must be something that exists independently, eternally. Clarke thought only a blockhead would think that it was some sort of endless chain of dependent beings. Because an endless series cannot have an internal cause, so it can't cause itself if it's an independent series. No one thing in an infinite series can cause the series as a whole, and it can't be something external because that doesn't really explain why the series is there. So he thought that whatever has existed from eternity must be something independent, and he thought unchangeable. And Clarke thinks we can't doubt this any more than 2 + 2 = 4. So there must be something eternal and self-existing. And this being must be infinite, it must be omnipresent, it must be intelligent, he thinks, and it must be infinitely wise. So he says if we look at everything around us, then it's obvious, given the order in the world, that there must be some sort of intelligent being that is responsible for that order. So the order and beauty in the world, he thinks, is adapted for a particular purpose. And we can see from the intricate makeup of the world that that particular being must be infinitely wise and good. And at that time, anatomy too was something that was becoming very popular, and the anatomists were discovering more and more things about the human body and how our human bodies are put together. So it seems, I suppose, crying out for some sort of explanation as to why there was so much order and purpose in the universe. Another famous argument for God's existence is put forward by William Paley. Paley gives us probably one of the most famous examples of a natural theology. He's usually the first thing that all A-level students would leap up and say, yes, we know about Paley. Paley was educated at Christ in Cambridge, and he was an Anglican priest. And the clue to what he's doing is there in the title. He wants to put forward an argument that there is an evidence of the existence and attributes of God in the natural world. And he suggests that we imagine, this might be familiar to some of you already, because we imagine that we're walking across a heath or across the countryside and we come across a watch. It's just lying there on the ground. So we pick up the watch, we examine it, and it's full of the little cogs. It wouldn't be nowadays if it's digital or an Apple Watch, but you can imagine it's an 18th century watch. It's full of those intricate bits, and we can see how it all works, fits together. So from that, Paley suggests that we would assume the existence of a watchmaker. We wouldn't just think that the watch had somehow come together in and of itself. So he says that there must have existed at some time an artificer, a watchmaker, who formed the watch for the purpose which we find it to answer. And that watchmaker would have understood the construction of the watch and would have designed the use of the watch. So it's an assumption that we make that the watch has some sort of designer. Paley then goes on to argue that the complexity of things in the natural world leads us to postulate a designer of the natural world in the same way that we would assume that the watch has a designer. So we should look, he suggests that every indication of contrivance, the world seems to be contrived, it fits together, all things in the natural world fit together beautifully. And so we can see that same level of fit and things working together as we could in the watch. So therefore, we can assume the existence of a designer, a world maker, rather than a watchmaker. Paley says it has been said that we can't lift our hand to our head without finding enough to convince that God exists. One should reflect, he suggests, on all the muscles, tendons, joints, the way they're arranged, the way the nerves communicate with the brain, etc., etc. And so we can see the wonder even in our own arms. So how these or any of these things come together without a designing, disposing intelligence is impossible to conceive. So the marks of contrivance lead us to that intelligent creator, according to Paley's argument. As you can probably imagine, this argument hasn't gone without some criticism since he proposed it. It's often said that David Hume challenged this argument after it was actually put forward. There is some dispute about that, but Hume is usually put forward as somebody who presents a substantial challenge to this design argument. Hume himself wrote dialogues concerning natural religion which weren't published until after he died because they were enormously controversial, because he raises some quite significant challenges to religious belief. Hume challenges the assumption that we can jump from looking at one instance of something and assume something about, say, the world at large. Any argument that's inductive is going to rest on certain assumptions, he says. So can we assume that everything in the universe has a cause, just if it's the case that some individual things in the universe has a cause? For Hume, that leap is not legitimate. It can't be made. So the problem Hume raises is with analogy. Hume says you can't make an analogy between a house, which has been built by a builder and designed, and the universe. Just because a house has a builder or a designer doesn't mean the whole universe has a designer. So anything that has a single individual or specific cause, that doesn't say anything about whether the system as a whole or the universe as a whole has a particular cause. Another challenge that Hume raised for natural theology and arguments for the existence of God it rests on the problem of evil and suffering. Hume's question in his dialogues is, if we imagine that someone's going to form their belief, their religious belief, on the basis of the evidence, then he suggests that we wouldn't believe in a good or powerful God. The evidence of the world is that there is a lot of suffering, a lot of human misery out there. So given that evidence, Hume finds it a problem to infer an all-powerful, all-good God. Because for Hume, and if God really is all-powerful, God could have made it such that there wasn't so much suffering in the world. So from a Humean perspective, we should be more sceptical about any inductive argument for a good or powerful God. Because what kind of universe is it? Hume suggests, or what kind of God would we imagine based on the world that we've got? For Hume, it's not necessarily that good or powerful one. So Hume raised a problem then for natural theology in the 18th century itself. But he didn't stop the enterprise of natural theology, because it's possible to try and respond to Hume to say why evil might exist, and to perhaps develop those arguments of natural theology, which is what happened in the 19th century. So although there's a long-standing belief that Hume somehow demolished Paley's argument about design and designers, that's not necessarily true. Paley himself wasn't really dealing so much in analogy. So I think a more powerful objection to Paley's argument comes from Darwin and Darwinism, where natural selection perhaps is some explanation for the apparent design in nature. So Paley's writing before Darwin, and Darwinism does give us some explanation for why it is the universe does see, or the things in the natural world, the biological world, do seem to fit together. Some of the reception of Darwinism led to a development in natural theology where the book of nature was seen to be complementary but quite distinct from the book of Revelation. So the two could exist and cohere, but nature couldn't necessarily tell us anything concrete about the existence of God. But there were still attempts to revise and reformulate the arguments for God's existence. And in the 19th century, natural theology became to be associated with various developments of the design argument and cosmological arguments, and also arguments based on morality. What explains morality? How do we explain why it is that human beings feel that there are certain things they ought to do? Perhaps God acts as a foundation for morality. When we get to, the Gifford Lectures, I must mention those, they were inaugurated in the 19th century, and they were established for the purpose of promoting, advancing, teaching, and diffusing the study of natural theology. So it was still felt that that God's creation, natural creation, wouldn't necessarily conflict with the revelation of God in the Bible. I think two of the biggest challenges that natural theology has to face more recently come from two particular sources, and I'd like to talk about those two main challenges to natural theology today. One of them is a naturalistic explanation for the universe and apparent design, and the other is the theological challenges. So our developments in science and so on, they suggest that we have an increasing understanding of how it is the universe has developed and come together. So that means that it's not so easy to point to natural theology as an explanation for why the world is as it is. Theological challenges, I think, stem in large part from Karl Barth's theological stance, and Karl Barth rejected the idea that reason can tell us anything about God independently of revelation. Barth thought that salvation comes from grace alone. So he was a Protestant theologian and rejected the idea that there could be any natural theology which was independent from God's self-revelation in Jesus. There's no such thing, Karl Barth argued, as a theology from below as he saw it. And knowledge of things to do with God can't be gained from observing things in the natural world. So the underpinning debate behind Barth's objection is a debate about reason and revelation. How corrupt is reason? Can human reason gain any knowledge about God and divine things aside from revelation? Barth thought absolutely no. He was German, obviously, 9. He was quite emphatic about that. So that's a very different objection to the objection based on science. So natural theologians have to think very deeply, really, about what kind of theology they are doing, and whether theologians actually need to think about whether they do want to embrace natural theology or not. So there are many theologians today who would reject natural theology because they might reject the idea that human reason can tell us anything about the divine. There have been various different responses to Barth. So Karl Barth argues that natural theology is the union of man existing outside of God's revelation. Rodney Holder has challenged Barth here and disputes this sharp distinction that we can make between reason and revelation. So Barth is certainly not the end of the story, and I think post-Barth there are perhaps two main forms of natural theology that I'll just draw your attention to for the last few minutes of this talk. One is the sort of continuation of what I've called evidentialism, this idea that somehow we can take evidence from the natural world and use that to say something about whether or not God exists or what that God might be like. This includes the argument from fine-tuning. One of the most famous philosophers of religion who takes an evidentialist view is Richard Swinburne, and he sees himself as being very much in a history of natural theology that goes back through the 18th century all the way back to thinkers like Augustine. For Swinburne, natural theology is the attempt to show the existence of God. It's a rational approach for him. And he uses reason. He also embraces the insights of science to put forward an argument to suggest that God's existence is more probable than not, essentially. So he thinks we should embrace reason, and he thinks that religious belief should be rational. Belief should be justified by the theist. The fine-tuning argument, as I said, is another example of this evidentialist approach. And William Lane Craig is very well known for putting forward a fine-tuning argument. We've heard a bit about fine-tuning already today, this morning. Craig defines fine-tuning as the idea that the physical laws of nature, when they're given mathematical expression, contain various constants. So that includes the gravitational constant, for example. And the values of those constants are independent of the laws themselves. So the values assumed are such that really tiny, small variations would make the universe life prohibiting. So the universe that we have is a result of, it goes against the odds, essentially. It's a result of these very specific values. And if they had been any different at all, the universe would be life prohibiting. It wouldn't contain the life that it has. So for Craig, this is something remarkable. And he thinks that when we look at the fine-tuning that there is, we can put forward an argument for God's existence. So he suggests that this fine-tuning is due either to physical necessity, to chance, or design. So those are the three options that he gives us. And he rejects the view that it is either physical necessity or chance. He thinks this cannot really give a proper explanation or a convincing explanation. For him, the universe that we have is comparable to firing a randomly aimed rifle shot into the Grand Canyon and having it kill a particular cockroach on the canyon wall. So that's his illustration of how amazing the fine-tuning is. So if you try to do that, the odds are you'd never be able to hit that cockroach. For Craig, because the odds are so against our universe, like hitting the cockroach, we can rule out the idea of chance. So he rejects chance as an explanation. He also rejects the idea of necessity, because any theory of everything, he says, would itself involve fine-tuning. A theory of everything is unlikely to say why it must be that we need, for example, a certain number of dimensions. So it still wouldn't really be a proper explanation. So because of that, Craig infers the existence of God as being the best explanation for why it is we have the universe. So God must have designed that fine-tuning to be such that a universe like ours now exists. So the multiverse, he rejects that idea of a multiverse because he thinks the one universe and designer is a much more simple hypothesis. And plus he says there's no particular evidence for multiverses. So for Craig, it is the simplest, most satisfying explanation, he suggests, that there is a designer. Obviously, there are atheist objections that have been raised against Craig. So, for example, the fact that, why is it not that we just happen to be here? So the universe that we should expect is the one that we've got, because we don't have any other universe by which to measure the universe that we have. So it just happens to be this way. It's this idea that, well, we're here asking the question. If the universe hadn't happened the way it had, there wouldn't be anybody to ask the question of why it's here rather than not here. So it could still be chance. Those who side with Craig and those who argue against him still think, though, that these metaphysical questions can be answered either through science or through reason. So Craig and his critics have a conviction that philosophical argument and the insights of science can tell us something about whether God exists and can justify God's existence. A different approach is that of a theology of nature. And this has become popular more recently. And those theologians who see themselves as putting forward a theology of nature would read these historical figures and the history of natural theology and say that actually those arguments are not meant to persuade an atheist. They're not meant to offer a complete justification for God's existence. Theologies of nature tend to start from within a religious tradition, so they tend to assume a certain religious faith, and they tend to argue that the methods of science can't stretch to understanding God. So science cannot explain everything. Science cannot answer those ethical questions. It can't answer those bigger questions about why are we here and what's the meaning of life, how should I live, and so on. So Alistair McGrath is an example of someone who attempts a theology of nature. So nature, he says, points to the divine. Science and theology he sees as being fully coherent. McGrath doesn't want to infer God's existence from fine-tuning, but he does see all the tiny variations that have to be just right as coherent with Augustine's idea of guiding creation through time to greater complexity. So he seeks a coherence between the science and his theology. Natural theology, he says, should be understood as the exploration of the link between the world that we experience and the transcendent reality. So he wants to bring the two together. One final example of a theology of nature that I'll mention today is put forward by Jack Hort. He describes himself as practicing a theology of nature in his approach to evolution. He adopts the idea of having to go beyond science to address questions of ultimate explanation. So the human mind has to go beyond nature in order to make ultimate sense of the world. And in some ways, I think Hort's argument is quite similar to Renee's argument this morning about the things that we have to presuppose in science, because Hort argues that science is based on a kind of faith. Science assumes that the world is rational, that truth is something that we should seek. So that's an ethical, normative value, and that our minds can understand truth. And Hort argues that if we adopt a materialistic universe based on chance, then we can't explain things like why it is that science should seek truth, because there are no ethical values there. So in terms of Darwinism and evolution, he argues that a naturalist neo-Darwinian, somebody like Dawkins, for example, cannot really embrace the idea that our minds can lead us to truth, because if our minds are just evolved to survive, then great, we'll survive, but how do we know the thoughts in our head are actually true or false? It makes no sense unless there's some sort of transcendent idea of truth. In the same way, you could argue this about ethics as well, that how can a Darwinian or neo-Darwinian have a concrete idea of ethical value? Because if we are just evolved to survive, then it makes no sense for a neo-Darwinian such as Dawkins to say that some beliefs are good or some beliefs are bad. So for Hort then, his theology is not trying to demonstrate God's existence. It's not trying to infer God's existence. He's not trying to justify belief through using science or reason. But he is creating a space for theology, and he is putting forward an argument that tries to convince that the concept of God or belief in God is necessary to underpin those particular values and a conviction to truth. So I think those two are two approaches, the evidentialist approach and this theology of nature approach, are two of the main ways or directions, if you like, that natural theology is going in today. And you can see, hopefully, that natural theology has a very rich history. That history tends to be read somewhat differently depending on which direction people want to follow today. But I hope that whistle-stop tour has been helpful. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Louise, for taking us all the way through those 1,500 years. And great on a warm afternoon. We've done really fast through the ages, so that's great. So over to you for questions and discussion. Over here. Do we have a mic going around? Thanks. Yeah.
Thanks for that tour. You put forward a relatively positive interpretation of Plato in respect to what one might think of as being the argument for morality, that he saw ethics as implying a soul and so forth. But one of the more popular anti-theistic arguments that is often promulgated today is based on the Euthyphro and the consequent dilemma and its consequences for the argument from morality. I wonder if you could help us square those two aspects of Plato.
Yes, that's interesting. Thank you. I think the Euthyphro does, I think, in its own way, try to get to grips with this question about whether morality is a result of will or power, the power of the gods, or whether it's something that goes beyond the gods. And I think, well, it's always hard, isn't it, in a Platonic dialogue to know what has actually been concluded. But at the end of that, I do see quite an argument that ethical value is not something that is just a result of will. And I think that comes through most of Plato's dialogues. In fact, it's a common theme that I see running through many of them, that it is not the gods who necessarily declare, or the gods will themselves abide by those ethical values. And I think you see that in the Phaedrus and in Plato's Republic as well. The concept of the forms is that of values that are eternal and immutable. I mean, I do read Plato, I think, through quite Neoplatonic eyes, but that's certainly the way that the Neoplatonists and the later Platonists of the 17th century, they read Plato as very much insisting that goodness is eternal and immutable. So in that sense then, Euthyphro, the dilemma that's raised in the Euthyphro about whether what's holy is holy because the gods say it's holy, or do the gods say it's holy because it's holy? I think through the Platonic corpus there's very much an insistence that it's holy. And I think that comes across too in his politics, that Socrates was certainly railing against the sophists of ancient Greece, the sophists who taught virtue. So they would teach virtue and they would just accept money to teach the art of persuasion. So virtue was defined as somebody who could teach the art of persuasion. It was rhetoric, it was spin doctoring, essentially. Marketing, advertising. And so I think Plato picks up from Socrates that this insistence that virtue is not just what's taught to the highest bidder. It's not. It's a much more profound value.
Turn your mic on.
Is this on? Oh, I thought it was on. Sorry. It's on now? Yes. Question over here, please. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. If you could keep your arm up. Yeah, see.
I just wanted to ask if the biblical reports or biblical texts that would support the evidence of God in nature. For example, one we heard yesterday, Psalm 19, the heavens declare the power of God, or the letter of Romans, or first of all, Wisdom chapter 13. That explicitly says or states that God is visible in nature. Do these texts play a role in the history of natural theology as well? Because you didn't refer to biblical texts, so the question is, well, did these texts have had any influence on thinking in natural theology?
Yes, thank you very much so. And I think those who embrace natural theology saw themselves as completely harmonised with that biblical view and repeatedly referred back to those texts. And not just in terms of natural theology, but also in terms of human beings having reason and rationality. And that's I suppose, the thing within us that can see through a glass darkly. I mean, it's an interesting question because, of course, the question then is, well, do we just embrace natural theology and trust reason because it says that in the Bible? So if you argue that, then actually that's a biblical thing based on revelation. So yeah, it's tricky. I'll perhaps leave that question there. But very much so, to your question, yes, they did see themselves and they used those biblical texts as justification for what they were doing.
Thank you. Yes, René. Sorry, I'll give.
Thank you very much. I had a question about Aquinas. You say there's sort of difficulty in interpreting what the 5 ways the Quinque Viae actually come to, whether they are supposed to, whether they are offered to convince atheists or something. So I had a colleague who was a big scholar on Aquinas, Jan Aartsen, and he argued that Aquinas in the Summa Theologica, he was actually engaging in the project of Scientia. And the five arguments for God's existence are, as you know, there are only 3 pages. It's nothing compared to the considerable number of other pages of that work. It's basically only to argue theology has a subject matter, and I can quickly prove the existence of that subject matter, and then he goes on with filling out all the details of the scientia. So what would you think about that? And a second little question, you didn't mention ontological arguments. Was that for a reason, or don't you think that falls within the confines of natural theology? Also because, you know, people like Gödel, they came up with their ontological arguments themselves. So a quite unlikely corner for that argument to arise.
Yeah, thank you. Just to answer the second question first, so to be honest, the reason I just didn't mention them was largely because of time. And I thought the cosmological design obviously focus a bit more on the natural world, and perhaps there's more conversation to be had with science for that. But yeah, I think I would include them to a certain extent as part of that natural theology, certainly in terms of commonalities, belief in human reason to understand something of metaphysical truth and so on. With regard to Aquinas, to be honest, I just thought I would mention that to flag it up, because the interpretation of Aquinas today is very important, say, within circles that, or within the discussion about what philosophy of religion should be, essentially. So, as well as Barthians, there are other theologians who resist philosophy of religion, and they do that largely on the basis of these older texts like Augustine and Aquinas and so on. And so there is debate. It's not straightforward. However, personally, I suppose I would situate Aquinas perhaps more within a theology of nature type approach. But I'm not an Aquinas scholar. I might just dodge that question a little bit, if that's all right for me to do so. But yeah, I think I'd situate him more in a sort of theology of nature approach. But I certainly, I don't think he rejects that whole enterprise entirely. So.
But that's a fascinating observation, that all those, the 5 arguments existence of God are in how many pages? 3 pages out of 20 volumes of Summa Theologica, isn't it? It's fascinating how it's a bit like Hume, you know, with his certain sections we all, you know, people remember, but actually the rest of it we don't remember. So just shows, you know, people. So there's a sort of natural selection of texts that get somehow promoted and talked about, and I don't know if that's a fair analogy, but anyway, I found that really interesting. Alexander has a question at the back.
Yes, thank you very much for this talk. You highlighted that there was some sort of a rebirth of or sudden upsurge in the interest in natural theology around the 17th century. One of the questions would be why that is. So one of the most interesting things I've read about natural theology was Alistair McGraw's remark that natural theology also played a political role in kind of tightening up all those loose ends that might otherwise create too much political turmoil. So it's very much a political endeavor as well. Could you comment on that? And in the light of that, how would you read today's attempts to renew theology of nature or natural theology?
Thank you. I would agree that there is a very strong political element in natural theology. It's something that I've researched in the book that Dennis mentioned, particularly in England. So I focused on natural theology in England, which actually had the tendency to be quite politically radical, because those who were more sort of conservative and in the 18th century, so it's more Tory, tended to reject reason and rejected natural theology because of that. So they tended to promote the idea of tradition and the wisdom within the tradition and the status quo, essentially, whereas those who defended natural theology, by and large, in England, tended to be Whigs, especially in the 18th century.
Please explain Whigs for us.
Sorry, yeah. I was just trying to think of a simple explanation without going too much into the monarchy. I suppose let's say that the Tories were much more conservative in terms of they wanted to conserve the structures of, I suppose, the monarchy, and it was about where the power lay essentially in Parliament or monarchy, which was superior. And then the Whigs challenged that essentially. They were against the sort of hereditary succession of a monarchy. So that the Whigs, there was a big power battle throughout the 18th century about Whigs and Tories, and what we see within that is that those who tended to be either politically radical or opposed to Tories often embrace natural theology. So natural theologians like Newton, like Clarke, were often seen to be quite suspect theologically. They were labelled as deists and quite politically dangerous. But even those who weren't seen as being politically dangerous, by embracing reason, they were effectively challenging the established Anglican Church. So it was a debate about where does revelation lie? Does it lie in the established church, which is connected to the monarchy and traditions? Do the bishops have the knowledge of revelation? Do they get to interpret revelation? Or does that knowledge come through human reason? If it comes through human reason, then we don't have any or so much need for bishops in the established church. So actually, this was enormously political at that time. So yeah, that's how I would see it as being political, particularly in England. And could you just elaborate? You had another question.
The question was if you could comment on how that might reflect on today's discussions between theology of nature and natural theology.
Yeah.
Would you see similar trends of somewhat more progressive ones aligning more with natural theology, perhaps?
Yeah, thank you. I think there's definitely potential, I think, especially with theologies of nature, because they tend to embrace the idea that we can learn from nature. So this idea of the contemplation of nature. So it's not just that we can look at nature and then infer the existence of God. It's that nature can actually teach us something. So within that, I think there's potentially a challenge to a utilitarian scientific approach which might see the earth as a resource to be plundered. A theology of nature might challenge that. It might encourage us to see nature in a completely different way, not as a resource, but as something to be much more valued. So many theologians of nature, or many theologians pursuing a theology of nature, tend to have an interest in ecology and eco-theology, for example. So there is perhaps the potential there. I don't think it's fully developed yet, so I think it's something that I would push for more development, but I think the potential is there. Yeah.
Could I just add one little point, Louise? Having lived through some of this recent history, that old, but I always remember my dear old tutor from Oxford days here at a conference, Arthur Peacock, here in a conference in Cambridge, standing up and saying, somebody asked him about natural theology, or about Paley, I think. He stood up and said, Paley is as dead as a dodo. Okay, I always remember that expression. And I think I was certainly raised with that thought and idea. We're talking about 80s, 90s, early 90s. But then I think it was a great surprise to people when natural theology came in through the back door, through the anthropic principle. And it was started by atheists as well. That made it even more puzzling. So, of course, Brandon Carter, we heard about this morning, from Paul Scheller, was an atheist. Martin Rees, who's really pushed, a lot of these people who've gone on about anthropic fine-tuning are not actually pushing natural theology. Others have, of course, using the same kind of material, the same data. You can interpret it in different ways. But I think what was kind of surprise for people is the revival of natural theology through the door of physics and cosmology in the latter years of the 20th century. Because biologists think, oh, it's all dead and we killed it off, and then suddenly the physicists go, oh, okay, we actually, anyway, it's sort of, I find these things quite interesting. It just shows you should never say never to ideas. They keep recycling, I think. Anyway, I might go on. Other questions? Sorry, over here, please. Yes, question over here. Thank you.
As far as natural theology is concerned, the question of God's agency also needs to be naturalized in a certain way. because God's agency is something which seems to be suspended here entirely on the forces of nature, or on a certain kind of a theorization about how nature can walk through an idea of the divine or some kind of spirituality. But independently speaking, God's agency must stand out there, which is maybe a part of nature, but larger than nature. So on that, how would you relate to some of these works, that, especially John Hott's work, if you have any clue about it?
Yes, that's a big question, thank you. Yeah, it's a whole separate area of debate, isn't it? And I think it depends how you define that agency, I suppose, because there is scope for different models of agency within the different theologies of nature. So I suppose one model of a theology of nature, which has been proposed more recently, but it bases itself within the Platonic tradition, is that of sort of nature as icon of the divine. So that's a sort of model based on contemplation. Now, it doesn't have any strong concept of, well, I suppose agency is that God is suffused in the divine, so God is revealed through the divine. But this idea of icon suggests that that nature somehow mirrors God. But yeah, I suppose the concept of divine action and agency is a question about how God is seen to act within that. And I think that kind of icon idea could potentially fit with a model in which God acts through those processes. A Neoplatonic model, for example, that's based on a kind of an emanation would see God as being able to act through the normal processes of nature, potentially. So that might cohere with some of the views of the more contemporary scientist theologians, where you can't detect God's action. I suppose that's the thing, isn't it? That model of agency that theology of nature might bring us towards would be one where you cannot ever detect that God has acted there. So it wouldn't be kind of, say, a model that explains God as acting through quantum particles. But this idea of God bringing creation towards fulfillment or guiding creation in some way, that might fit with a natural theology. I mean, some of the thinkers in the 17th century, some Platonist thinkers saw or believed that there was this idea of a plastic nature, they called it, because they resisted the direct action of God on nature. So for Newton and Samuel Clarke, God was needed to constantly intervene. So even to keep planets in their orbits, God would have to keep coming in and fixing the system every so often. But there were other natural theologians at the time who didn't like that idea. They didn't like the direct agency of God. So they then embraced this idea of a plastic nature, that there is a spiritual force within nature that's different from God, but isn't just a material sort of mechanistic universe. So that idea of a plastic nature, potentially, I suppose it's got some similarities with some of the natural theologies today.
If anyone here buys the book Let Newton Be, which is the book of the play that we sponsored back in 2009, and in the back is a DVD of the play, and if you watch that play, it's a lovely play actually, originally put on by the Menagerie Theatre Company here in Cambridge, and there's a great discussion there in the play between Newton and Leibniz about that very point, which is, if you want a dramatic representation, and it's actually not just a representation, it's using, the whole play uses the original words, or written words of Newton, Leibniz, and the other major players, so it's a rather fascinating. So I do recommend that book. I'm going to do a plug now when I think about it, for Let Newton Be. But make sure you get either the US DVD version or the UK, okay? And there are two versions, and I hope they're both on the bookstores, so anybody hopefully can look at that. We have a few more minutes for other questions. If anyone else, yes, over here, please. Thank you. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you, Dr. Hickman, for the presentation. I wonder whether you have, when it comes to natural theology, are there lessons that we can learn from other cultures, like the African culture? Maybe have you managed to look at some of the literature from the African culture on natural theology? I'm sure even Asian culture. Thank you.
Yeah, I haven't at present, although it is something that I would like to pursue. The microphone's gone now, but I'd be interested if you have any thoughts about how that might, if you know something that might then perhaps help to reinterpret any of this or shed other insights. I'd be interested to know. But no, I haven't yet. And the focus of my research has been mostly in sort of 17th, 18th century English thought. But in terms of the contemporary natural theology, then yeah, I would be interested in pursuing that.
Would you like to share any thoughts on that yourself? I mean, do you have any ideas you'd like to share with us? Yeah. Okay, or maybe somebody does from some other continent. Yes, please do. Yeah, take this.
Thank you. Yes. So I'm from India. I know the some of the theology that's there in India. So they say that it's kind of it's a very, very, very different theology from the European as well as the Christian. So, one of the main thing about Hinduism, Hindu theology is something like. Just a second, I want to put in the words. Yeah, so it also talks about different ages. It's a lot more, something like aeons. It's called Yuga. I'm not sure if you know, but it's called Yuga. So one of my Hindu friend, she told me that the theology that they say is, it follows the pattern of, how the life form came. So that is about Hindu theology. And one more thing which I actually thought about was primitive tribes and the non-written natural theology. That is something that...
Yeah, thank you. And something I could add actually is that Julius Lipner and Douglas Headley I know they've done some work together. So Douglas Headley is a kind of a theologian of nature, and he's worked in Cambridge with Julius Lipner, who specialises in a lot of Hindu thought and Eastern thought. And I know they've done some work together to develop some of these overlaps, I think. So yeah, there is some work that's being done. Of course, there are theories that actually, although some of the Neoplatonists got a lot of ideas from Hinduism potentially. So there is, I think, some scope for looking at that. Yeah, but thank you.
Any other questions? We have, yes, Tim.
Just a comment, and you could tell me whether you agree with it. It's just a thought about the history of natural theology, which is that certain basic themes, I think, have always been there, and you're reaching all the way back to Plato, kind of brings this out. Arguments for the existence of God typically have always been about existence, order, and value. Those are the kind of three fundamental considerations. But what's happened in the history of natural theology is it's responding to changes in our understanding of the nature of explanation, right? So you think of scientific explanation, going from the Aristotelian model of deduction from necessary principles, Galileo and others sort of paving the way towards a different way of thinking about scientific explanation. And we continue to see developments, statistical forms of explanation, the increasing emphasis on Bayesian confirmation theory as a way of modeling good explanation. And then you see then people saying, oh, right, going back to these older arguments and recasting same basic intuitive kind of driving idea, but in the new form as we kind of come to, as we think, clear understanding of the kind of the form or methods of explanation. Does that seem right to you?
Yeah, it's a really interesting observation. I think perhaps I'd still see these concerns with ethical questions as being a common thread, even though those explanations and ideas of explanations have perhaps developed. Because I suppose the explanations perhaps apply to the physical world, the world of matter, whereas those bigger questions about ethics and value have somehow persisted throughout that. So I think in seeing that as a common strand, I suppose that's a kind of persistent thing. So maybe the explanation is more of a factor in looking at sort of natural theologies as an argument for God's existence, because you could read Plato as focusing on that, or you could read him as not being so bothered about the arguments for God's existence, but being more interested in those ethical questions. So yeah, it just interests me the way that different people read that history. So somebody who is concerned with the justification of belief would perhaps trace that back to Plato, whereas there are other theologians who would reject the justification of belief, and philosophers who would reject that, and yet perhaps they would trace that emphasis on questions of goodness and truth as being something that was perhaps of more value there in Plato. So yeah, thank you for that. It's interesting.
We have time for one. I'd like to ask a question. Oh, a very quick one, but just coming back to Psalm 119, it just seems to be there's a whole aesthetic domain which we haven't touched on very much. But I just wonder, and thinking of Romans 1:20 and these passages, and a lot of it, the examples coming to my mind were a couple of friends I had. One was a student who is a very committed atheist, but he liked rock climbing. And I remember he went up from Oxford up to Scotland for the weekend, climbing in the mountains of Skye, if you know that's an island. It's very beautiful. And when he came back, and I saw him a few days later, he said, "You know, I now believe in God." And I said, "Oh, okay, interesting." So what happened? You know, expecting he'd been to some religious meeting in Scotland. He said, "No, it was just so beautiful. I got up and I looked at the mountains. I just thought, oh, there's got to be a God." Right. Okay. So it wasn't all these rational arguments. And I wonder actually, and I have another friend actually, I remember, who was also a very lifelong atheist, but a keen gardener. And then she ended up in our church, and I asked her what happened. She said, I just went out on a spring day and I looked at my beautiful garden and the flowers. I thought, there's got to be a God. Just like that, okay. And I wonder, you know, we talk a lot about all these rationalist arguments, and we have discussions and books, but I wonder actually in practice, if you like at ground level, whether actually that aesthetic, almost instinct, insight, I don't know, intuition might be a better word, actually plays a bigger role. What do you think?
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I mean, Darwin himself commented on Paley's argument, didn't he? And said that he could appreciate the intuitive appeal, even if he didn't accept it in its entirety. But I think the aesthetic can play an enormous role in the theologies of nature, certain theologies of nature, particularly the more Platonic ones. So, I mean, Douglas Headley, for example, who puts forward a very Platonic theology of nature, who appeals to that concept of beauty. So if you can learn from nature, then you can, by contemplating the beauty in nature, if that nature is a kind of icon or image of the divine, then that could sort of lead you by just the experience of the aesthetic to something beyond. And that experience reminded me a bit of Iris Murdoch as well. So Murdoch is an atheist Platonist, but for her, just the experience of something aesthetic, a piece of art or a hovering kestrel, can draw our attention, and it's in that drawing of our attention away from ourselves and away from that sort of selfish inwardness, can draw us outwards to something beyond, or can sort of take us on that journey towards appreciating a transcendent good or so on. So I mean, she's somebody who, as an atheist, gets very close to that idea of a transcendent good through the aesthetic. So yeah, that's interesting. I definitely think there's a role for the aesthetic now.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, our time is up now. Let's just thank Louise again for a fascinating talk. And